The battlefield was chaos, a place where metal met flesh, where screams were swallowed by the roar of explosions. Yet, in the midst of the carnage, he stood unscathed. No armor, no shield, only his bare skin against the enemy's wrath. Elias was a mystery. A soldier without protection, moving through the crossfire like a ghost. Bullets curved away from him, shrapnel seemed to slow before reaching his body, and explosions left him untouched. His comrades called it luck. The enemy whispered of dark magic. But Elias knew the truth, a truth he had sworn to keep hidden. It wasn't luck, nor magic. It was something far more powerful. The first time he realized it, he was just a boy. A rusty nail had punctured his foot, yet there was no blood, no pain. Only a faint tingling sensation before his skin closed itself, leaving no scar. He learned to keep his secret, to pretend he was like everyone else. But on the battlefield, there was no room for pretending. His survival was too obvious, too impossible to explain. As the smoke cleared, Elias scanned the horizon. The enemy was retreating, their morale shattered by the man who defied death. His fellow soldiers cheered, clapping him on the back, eyes wide with disbelief. But Elias felt no victory. Only fear, fear that his secret would be discovered. The captain approached, his face a mixture of awe and suspicion. "How do you do it, Elias? Not even a scratch. What are you made of?" Elias forced a laugh, shrugging. "Guess I'm just lucky." But he knew it was more than luck. He was different, made of something beyond human understanding. And the world wasn't ready for that truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't afraid of the enemy or the bullets that couldn't touch him. He was afraid of what he was becoming, and who would come looking for him once they found out. Little did he know, someone was already watching. Elias couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even as the camp settled for the night, with weary soldiers drifting into uneasy sleep, his eyes kept darting to the shadows beyond the flickering firelight. He knew better than to ignore his instincts, they'd saved his life too many times to doubt them now. He slipped away from the group, moving with practiced silence, his steps light on the rocky ground. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that danced with the wind. But one shadow didn't move. It stood still, a silhouette against the jagged rocks. Elias's heart raced. He edged closer, his muscles tense, ready to spring. But the figure spoke first, its voice low and steady. "You're not like the others." The words hung in the air, heavy with knowing. Elias's blood ran cold. He forced himself to stay calm, masking his fear with a casual tone. "I don't know what you're talking about." The figure stepped into the moonlight, a man, tall and lean, with piercing eyes that seemed to see through him. His face was weathered, marked by age and experience, but his posture was strong, confident. He wore no uniform, no insignia. Just plain clothes that seemed out of place on the battlefield. "Bullets avoid you. Fire can't burn you." "I've seen it all before," the man said, his gaze never leaving Elias. "You don't belong here." Elias's fists clenched. "Who are you?" The man smirked. "Someone who knows what you are, and what you're capable of." A chill crept down Elias's spine. No one was supposed to know. He had spent his whole life hiding his secret, staying under the radar. But this man spoke as if he understood everything. "Look, I don't know who you are or what you think you know, but I'm just a soldier trying to survive, same as anyone else," Elias replied, his voice steady despite the fear churning inside him. The man's expression softened, almost pitying. "Keep lying to yourself if it helps you sleep at night. But they'll come for you, sooner or later. And when they do, luck won't be enough." Elias's heart skipped a beat. "Who's coming?" The man turned to leave, his figure blending into the darkness. But his final words echoed long after he was gone. The ones who created you, and the ones who fear you. Elias stood frozen, his mind racing. Created? Feared? None of it made sense. Yet, a deep, unsettling feeling told him it was the truth. He wasn't just different. He was something else entirely. For the first time in his life, Elias wasn't just afraid of being discovered. He was afraid of what he might discover about himself. As the wind howled through the canyon, Elias realized his life would never be the same. The secret he had guarded so carefully was no longer his alone. And whoever that man was, he had answers Elias desperately needed. He just didn't know if he was ready to face them. The next morning, the camp was buzzing with the usual chaos of soldiers preparing for the day's trek across the rugged terrain. But Elias couldn't focus. His mind kept returning to the figure in the shadows, and the cryptic words that had left his heart pounding in the dead of night. The ones who created you, and the ones who fear you. He tried to shake it off, throwing himself into the tasks at hand. But every clink of metal, every whisper in the wind, seemed to carry the weight of the stranger's warning. And then there was the other matter, the nagging suspicion that, deep down, the man had been right. There was something more to Elias than he'd ever known. As the day wore on, Elias found himself alone at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the horizon, lost in thought. The world around him seemed distant, disconnected, as if he were seeing it through a fog. He had always felt different, stronger, faster, more resistant to pain. But he'd never questioned it. It was just the way he was. Yet now, every crack in his body's resilience felt like a piece of a puzzle he wasn't ready to solve. Elias, you look like you're about to jump out of your skin. The voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. Elias turned to see Kira, his closest friend in the camp. She was leaning against a nearby rock, arms crossed, a knowing smile on her face. Kira had always been able to read him like an open book. What's going on? You've barely said a word all morning, she pressed, her voice soft but insistent. Elias hesitated. Kira had always been there for him, but there were things, secrets, that he couldn't share. Not with her. Not with anyone. I'm fine. Just tired, he lied, plastering on a smile. But Kira wasn't fooled. She stepped forward, her expression serious. You don't look fine. Something's going on, and I can see it in your eyes. You're hiding something from me. Again. Elias's stomach churned. He knew Kira was loyal, but revealing his secret would change everything between them. How could he tell her the truth when he didn't even understand it himself? Before he could respond, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the air, causing both of them to snap to attention. Elias, Kira. We've got a situation. It was Captain Holt, the leader of their unit. His face was grim, his eyes sharp with determination. He wasted no time. We've been ordered to move out. We're heading deeper into enemy territory. Elias's pulse quickened. The timing was off. He couldn't help but feel that whatever was waiting for them out there, it was tied to everything that had been unraveling inside him. The unease that had settled in his bones overnight had only grown worse. The truth he had been avoiding was closer than ever. Gather your gear, soldiers, Captain Holt barked, turning to leave. And stay sharp. The enemy won't give us any mercy. The day's mission was supposed to be routine, a simple scouting operation. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that it was anything but. As they packed up and began to move out, Kira shot him a worried look, but Elias avoided her gaze. They trekked through rugged mountains, the weight of uncertainty hanging heavily over them. The path grew narrower, the cliffs steeper, and the air thinner. As they approached the target zone, the sky darkened unnaturally fast. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. By the time they reached the outskirts of a narrow canyon, the shadows seemed to stretch long and ominous, and Elias's heart began to race again. something was wrong. Suddenly, there was a noise, a deep, unnatural hum that vibrated through the ground beneath their boots. It felt as though the very earth was alive, pulsing with energy. The soldiers froze, their hands instinctively reaching for weapons. What in God's name? Elias muttered under his breath. The hum grew louder, echoing through the canyon walls. And then, out of the darkness, figures began to appear, tall, shadowy figures, their movements swift and graceful. They emerged from the darkness like specters, their faces obscured by black masks. Kira's hand shot out to grab Elias's arm. What are they? Who are they? Elias had no answer. He could only watch, frozen in place, as the figures closed in. And in that moment, something inside him snapped, a rush of heat, like fire through his veins. His muscles tensed, his vision sharpened, and a primal instinct surged to the surface. Before he knew what was happening, Elias was charging forward, faster than he had ever moved in his life. His body surged with power, and the figures around him seemed to slow, like they were stuck in time. His first strike landed with brutal precision, knocking one of the shadowy figures off its feet. But as soon as he made contact, the world around him exploded into chaos. The soldiers had been caught off guard, and the battle raged in a blur of motion and noise. In the midst of it all, Elias was no longer the soldier he had been before. Something had awakened inside him, something terrifyingly powerful. He fought with a ferocity that left even him in awe. But in the back of his mind, a nagging question lingered: who were these figures, and what did they want? And more importantly, what had just happened to him? The chaos of the battle swirled around Elias like a storm. The shadowy figures seemed to multiply with every passing second, their movements too fast to track, but Elias was different. The surge of energy in his veins made him faster, stronger, unlike anything he had ever felt. His blows landed with an intensity that shook the earth beneath him. His heart pounded like a war drum in his chest, but there was no fear. Only the drive to fight and survive. With every strike, every move, Elias felt more in control, more attuned to something primal inside him. It wasn't just about the battle. It was about the power that was coursing through his body. He could feel it growing, expanding, as if his very essence was changing. The sensation was exhilarating, yet terrifying. Kira was beside him, fighting with the same determination, but Elias could see the confusion in her eyes. She had always known him as the quiet, reserved soldier, not the one who could shatter an opponent with a single punch. And yet, here he was, moving with a fluidity and force that seemed almost unnatural. The ground beneath them trembled again, and Elias turned to see another wave of figures advancing. He was ready to fight again, but something held him back. There was a sudden shift in the air, a weightlessness, a quiet before the storm. For a brief moment, everything around him stilled. And then, as though it had always been waiting for this moment, the truth hit him. The shadowy figures weren't enemies. They weren't here to fight. They were here to test him. The realization struck like a lightning bolt, and for the first time since the battle began, Elias froze. His eyes flicked to the soldiers around him, his comrades who were still locked in combat. Kira was struggling against a figure who had her in a deadly hold, and Elias's heart twisted. He couldn't let this go on. He had to stop it. He had to understand what was happening. Stop! Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The words echoed off the canyon walls, and for a split second, the figures paused. Their eyes, dark, empty, yet somehow filled with purpose, met his. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. Enough! Elias barked again, his voice laced with the power he didn't know he had. It was as if his very will could shape the air around him. To his surprise, the figures slowly released their holds, stepping back, but not retreating. They didn't seem threatened by him. They simply observed. Kira gasped as she scrambled away from the figure holding her. She shot Elias a confused look, but before she could speak, one of the figures stepped forward. It was taller than the rest, cloaked in shadows that seemed to shift like smoke. It moved with an unnatural grace, its every step silent, yet full of authority. As it reached Elias, the air seemed to grow colder. The energy in the air, the tension, it was palpable. "You have awakened," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing in Elias's mind as much as his ears. Elias's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just speaking to him. It was communicating with him, somehow. Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice steady but his mind racing. He had so many questions, but the most pressing one was about the power he had just discovered. The figure's head tilted, as if considering how to answer. "We are your creators. And you are the culmination of a dream long forgotten." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elias shook his head, his mind trying to make sense of what had just been said. "I don't understand." "What do you mean, creators?" The figure raised a hand, its fingers like obsidian claws. The air shimmered in front of Elias, and suddenly, memories that didn't belong to him flooded his mind. Images flashed, fragments of a life that wasn't his own. He saw a lab, sterile and cold, filled with machines he couldn't comprehend. He saw a woman, tall, dark-haired, and impossibly strong, holding a child. And then the child, his child, looking up with eyes that glowed with a strange, otherworldly power. A voice echoed in his mind. The soldiers of old wore armor to protect themselves from the world around them. But your strength lies not in armor, but in what you are. Elias gasped, stumbling back. He tried to catch his breath as the world around him seemed to blur. The memories kept coming. The images kept shifting. "Who am I?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure before him stepped closer, its face obscured in shadow. "You are not just a soldier, Elias. You were born of science and strength. The warriors of the past could only dream of the power you now possess." Kira, still panting from her fight, approached Elias cautiously. She had been watching him, sensing that something had changed in him, in the way he carried himself, the way he spoke. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Elias, what's going on? What did they do to you?" Elias turned to her, his face a mask of confusion and determination. He had always been the quiet one, the one who kept his thoughts to himself. But now, with this new knowledge, he knew that the answers lay ahead. He couldn't turn back now. The figure nodded slowly, acknowledging the bond between them. "You were meant to lead. To unite those who have fallen to fear. But first, you must embrace your true self." Elias's breath caught in his throat. What did that mean? What was he supposed to do with this power? And who was he really? The figure turned, its form beginning to fade into the shadows. "The world you once knew is gone. Now, it is time to reclaim what was lost. The armor you once needed is no longer necessary." With that, the figure disappeared, leaving Elias standing at the center of the battlefield. The soldiers around him looked confused, but Elias felt something shift inside him. It was as if a door had opened, and he had no choice but to walk through. "Elias, what just happened?" Kira asked, her voice trembling. She was afraid, not of the fight, but of him. "I don't know," Elias replied quietly. "But I think I'm only just beginning to understand." The canyon fell silent, the echoes of the battle now replaced by an uneasy calm. Elias knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything. Elias's world had become a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. He had just learned a horrifying truth: the battle he had been fighting wasn't a struggle for survival, it was a test. But for what? Who were these figures, and what did they want from him? The air felt thick with uncertainty, and even though the battlefield had fallen silent, the weight of the moment pressed down on Elias's chest like a 1,000-pound stone. He turned to Kira, her eyes wide with disbelief, her grip still tight on his arm as though trying to hold on to something solid in a world that no longer made sense. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you've changed. That power, it's like nothing I've ever seen." Elias couldn't find the words to respond. He didn't fully understand what was happening to him, and the weight of that knowledge was suffocating. He had always thought of himself as just another soldier, someone who followed orders, who kept his head down and did his duty. But now, he was something else, something greater. He could feel it in every fiber of his being. The power was real, undeniable. But with it came a sense of isolation, a sense of being disconnected from everything he had known. The memory of the figure's words echoed in his mind. "The armor you once needed is no longer necessary." But what did that mean? Why had they chosen him? Why him? And if he wasn't the soldier he thought he was, then who was he? "I don't know what's happening," Elias muttered, the words barely audible. "But I have to find out. I can't let this go." Kira hesitated, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find the person she once knew. "You're not alone in this, Elias. Whatever's happening, we'll face it together. But you need to understand that you're not just a soldier anymore. You're more than that. You were chosen for something bigger." Elias looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling. He could feel the energy coursing through him, itching to be released. It was as if the world itself was waiting for him to make his move, to unleash what had been awakened. But could he control it? Could he truly wield this newfound power, or would it consume him? Without warning, the ground beneath them rumbled once more, this time more violently. A distant roar echoed through the canyon, sending a shiver down Elias's spine. He wasn't sure if the danger was coming for them, or if it was something even more dangerous, something worse than the shadowy figures he had just fought. "What was that?" Kira asked, her voice sharp with concern. "Elias, something's wrong." Elias didn't have an answer, but his instincts kicked in. He could feel the presence of something, a dark energy, pushing against the air, pulling at him like a magnet. It wasn't just the remnants of the battle. Something else was coming. Something worse. "We need to move," Elias said, his voice steady despite the rising fear in his chest. "We're not safe here." He grabbed Kira's hand and pulled her away from the center of the battlefield. The soldiers, still recovering from the strange confrontation, watched them go, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. But Elias didn't have time to explain. He had to focus. There was something out there, something that would test everything he had just learned. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the feeling of dread intensified. The walls around them seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker. The air was thick with the scent of something burning, a chemical tang that made Elias's throat dry. And then, they saw it. In the distance, at the far end of the canyon, a shape emerged. It was huge, towering over everything in its path. At first, it seemed like a mirage, just a flicker in the distance. But as it drew closer, Elias's heart sank. The thing that was coming wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way he understood. It was a machine. The massive construct moved with purpose, its metal frame reflecting the setting sun in sharp, jagged glints. It was an amalgamation of technology and destruction, a creature of steel and circuitry, built to withstand anything, to destroy everything in its path. Its eyes, glowing red with an eerie, unnatural light, locked onto Elias as it advanced. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just any machine. This was a weapon, a force of nature made to annihilate. And it was coming for them. "Elias, what is that thing?" Kira asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias could only stare in horror. He had no answers. No explanations. All he knew was that the power inside him, the one he had only just begun to understand, was the only thing that stood between this machine and their survival. He turned to Kira, his expression grim. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low and firm. "We fight." But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept in. Could they really fight something like this? Could he really stand up to it with nothing but his newfound strength? The machine's massive form loomed larger with every second. It was like a beast of war, a creature forged in the darkest corners of science, its purpose clear: to destroy, to wipe out everything in its path. Elias's heart raced. He didn't know if he could stop it. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let Kira, or anyone else, suffer at the hands of this machine. He gritted his teeth and clenched his fists, the power inside him surging to the surface, ready to be unleashed. It was time to find out what he was truly capable of. Elias stood there, his body trembling with an intensity he had never known before. The massive machine loomed ahead, its glowing red eyes fixed on him, its mechanical limbs moving with unnerving precision. The ground beneath their feet rumbled, shaking with the weight of its power. Kira, standing beside him, clutched his arm, her grip tight, but Elias could feel the fear radiating from her. For a moment, everything was still. The air, thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath. Elias didn't know what he was supposed to do. He was a soldier, yes, but this was something beyond anything he had ever encountered. The power inside him surged again, but he couldn't tell if it was ready, if it was enough. Could he truly fight a machine that seemed unstoppable? The machine's massive footstep echoed like a drumbeat, and Elias knew it was coming for them. There was no time to waste. "Elias, we can't just stand here," Kira cried, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "It's too strong. You don't even know what you're dealing with." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and doubt. "I don't care. I've been chosen for something. I'll find out what that is." Kira's eyes searched his face for a moment, as if weighing his words, and then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Then let's fight." Without another word, Elias sprang into action. His legs carried him forward with an unnatural speed, his heart pounding in his chest as the power inside him roared to life. Every muscle, every fiber, felt like it was charged with electricity. He was moving faster than he had ever thought possible, his instincts guiding him toward the machine with a purpose he couldn't fully comprehend. As he ran, the ground beneath him shook with each step of the mechanical behemoth. It raised one of its colossal arms, aiming to strike down. The sound of its movement was like thunder, and Elias felt a surge of adrenaline. He had no armor, no weapons, just the raw power coursing through him. The machine's fist came crashing down. With a roar, Elias leaped into the air, defying gravity, as his body surged upward with the raw energy he could barely control. He collided with the machine's arm, the impact reverberating through his entire body. For a moment, it felt like he was hitting a solid wall, metal against flesh. But the power inside him refused to relent, and the metal buckled under the force of his blow. He didn't have time to celebrate his success. The machine, clearly stunned, turned its attention to him, its eyes flaring brighter, more menacing. It retaliated, launching a barrage of energy blasts from its arm. The blasts were like lightning, crackling through the air with blinding intensity. "Elias, move!" Kira screamed, her voice filled with panic. Elias dodged the first blast, but the machine's targeting system was precise. He barely managed to avoid another blast that grazed his side, sending a wave of pain through him. He stumbled but regained his footing quickly. His body was still reeling from the sheer power he had just unleashed, but there was no time to rest. He had to end this. The machine's arm swung again, this time aimed directly at him. But Elias was ready. He dove underneath the massive limb, rolling on the ground with a fluidity that seemed almost unnatural. As he came up, he felt the energy inside him crackling like a live wire, ready to explode. He closed his eyes for just a moment, centering himself, feeling the immense power surge within him. And then he ran. His movements were faster than before, every step sending waves of force through the ground as he closed the gap between himself and the machine. He was almost there when the machine reacted, turning its body toward him and aiming another blast. But this time, Elias was faster. He leaped toward the machine's chest, his body colliding with its metal frame, sending a shockwave of energy through its circuits. The machine staggered, its glowing red eyes flickering as if it were struggling to maintain control. Elias didn't stop. He punched the machine's core, his fist connecting with a burst of energy that rippled outward, causing the machine to stagger back. The ground beneath them cracked as the machine's body trembled, trying to stabilize itself. Elias! Kira shouted from behind him, her voice desperate. You're doing it. Keep going. But Elias wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. His strength was beginning to wane, the energy inside him sputtering in short bursts. He could feel the strain in his muscles, the exhaustion creeping in. The machine retaliated with one final blast. The beam of energy shot out with terrifying speed, and Elias didn't see it coming. It hit him square in the chest, throwing him backward with a force that knocked the breath out of him. He crashed into the ground, his vision blurring as pain shot through every part of his body. He could barely move. His body felt like it was on fire. But as he lay there, struggling to breathe, something inside him clicked. He realized that he didn't need to fight with brute strength alone. He wasn't just a soldier, and he wasn't just relying on power. It was about trust. Trust in himself, in Kira, and in the path he had been given. Elias pushed himself up, his heart pounding. He reached deep within, tapping into the core of his energy. This time, it wasn't about force. It was about understanding. He closed his eyes, focused, and let the power flow through him in a way he had never done before. He felt a connection to everything around him, everything he had been fighting for. Elias dodged the first blast, but the machine's targeting system was precise. He barely managed to avoid another blast that grazed his side, sending a wave of pain through him. He stumbled but regained his footing quickly. His body was still reeling from the sheer power he had just unleashed, but there was no time to rest. He had to end this. The machine's arm swung again, this time aimed directly at him. But Elias was ready. He dove underneath the massive limb, rolling on the ground with a fluidity that seemed almost unnatural. As he came up, he felt the energy inside him crackling like a live wire, ready to explode. He closed his eyes for just a moment, centering himself, feeling the immense power surge within him. And then he ran. His movements were faster than before, every step sending waves of force through the ground as he closed the gap between himself and the machine. He was almost there when the machine reacted, turning its body toward him and aiming another blast. But this time, Elias was faster. He leaped toward the machine's chest, his body colliding with its metal frame, sending a shockwave of energy through its circuits. The machine staggered, its glowing red eyes flickering as if it were struggling to maintain control. Elias didn't stop. He punched the machine's core, his fist connecting with a burst of energy that rippled outward, causing the machine to stagger back. The ground beneath them cracked as the machine's body trembled, trying to stabilize itself. Elias! Kira shouted from behind him, her voice desperate. You're doing it. Keep going. But Elias wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. His strength was beginning to wane, the energy inside him sputtering in short bursts. He could feel the strain in his muscles, the exhaustion creeping in. The machine retaliated with one final blast. The beam of energy shot out with terrifying speed, and Elias didn't see it coming. It hit him square in the chest, throwing him backward with a force that knocked the breath out of him. He crashed into the ground, his vision blurring as pain shot through every part of his body. He could barely move. His body felt like it was on fire. But as he lay there, struggling to breathe, something inside him clicked. He realized that he didn't need to fight with brute strength alone. He wasn't just a soldier, and he wasn't just relying on power. It was about trust. Trust in himself, in Kira, and in the path he had been given. Elias pushed himself up, his heart pounding. He reached deep within, tapping into the core of his energy. This time, it wasn't about force. It was about understanding. He closed his eyes, focused, and let the power flow through him in a way he had never done before. He felt a connection to everything around him, everything he had been fighting for. With a final, mighty cry, Elias surged forward, focusing all his energy into one single, devastating strike. The explosion of force was like nothing he had ever experienced. It was as if the very fabric of reality shifted as his power collided with the machine's core. The machine shook violently, and then, with a deafening sound, it collapsed to the ground, its glowing eyes fading to nothingness. Silence. For a moment, all Elias could hear was the rush of his own breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He stood there, drenched in sweat, the power still vibrating through his body. He had done it. The machine was destroyed. But Elias knew one thing now: the real test wasn't about fighting a machine. It was about understanding the strength that lay within. And now, he finally understood. The silence after the battle was overwhelming. The wreckage of the machine lay in front of Elias, its massive form twisted and broken, its once glowing red eyes dimmed to nothing. He stood motionless, still trying to process everything that had just happened. The energy that had coursed through him only moments ago had now drained, leaving him feeling weak and disoriented. His body felt like it had been through a storm, but his mind was clearer than it had ever been. Kira slowly approached him, her face a mix of awe and concern. "Elias, you did it. We did it." Her voice brought him back to reality. He turned toward her, offering a tired smile. I don't know how. I just followed what felt right. It wasn't about fighting the machine. It was about trusting myself, and trusting you." Kira stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Her grip was gentle, yet firm. "You were more than just a soldier. You were a beacon for all of us. And you still are." Elias's heart swelled at her words, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just about him. It had never been just about him. The real power wasn't in the energy that surged through him or the strength to take down the machine. It was in the connections he had forged along the way, in the trust they had built, in the belief that humanity had something more to offer than technology and force. "Do you really believe that?" Elias asked, his voice softer now. "I do," Kira said, her eyes unwavering. "I've seen it in you. In all of us. We don't need machines, Elias. We don't need armor or weapons. We've got something far stronger." Elias looked at her, seeing the conviction in her eyes. It was then that the truth finally hit him. The strength they had been fighting for wasn't about overcoming the machines or defeating an enemy. It was about what they had inside, what they had always had inside. Humanity's true strength wasn't in its capacity for violence or destruction. It was in its heart, its resilience, and its ability to push forward, even when faced with the impossible. He took a deep breath, the weight of the revelation settling in. It was so simple, yet it had eluded him for so long. He had been searching for an answer, for a way to fight back against the odds. But the answer had been inside him all along. "We don't need armor," Elias said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "We never did." Kira nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding. "Exactly. The world has taught us that we need to protect ourselves with armor, with strength, with power. But it's the people we choose to trust, the courage we find within ourselves, and the bonds we create that truly make us invincible. For a long moment, they stood there, the weight of the words sinking in. The battlefield was silent now, the echo of their struggle fading into the distance. But Elias knew that the real battle had always been within. He had fought against the machine, yes, but the greatest challenge had been to understand the power he already had, his humanity. Elias turned toward the horizon, his heart filled with a sense of peace he had never known before. The future was uncertain, but he no longer feared it. He had learned that the strength he needed to face whatever came next was already within him. And as long as he had his faith in humanity, he knew they would endure. "We've got work to do," Elias said, his voice filled with resolve. "There's still a world to save." Kira smiled, stepping beside him. "And we're not alone in it. We never were." Together, they walked forward, the path ahead uncertain but full of hope. They had found the truth about their strength, the truth that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. They didn't need armor. They didn't need weapons. All they needed was each other, and the unshakable belief that, no matter the challenge, they could overcome it. And that was enough.